From Charles' dominant performance against veteran Beneil Dariush to heading into his second title fight hungrier than ever, here's how Charles Oliveira's recent win sets up a rematch with Islam. Charles let the entire world know that he's still one of the best fighters going around.
I promise you, I'm gonna get this back.
When he knocked out Benny in the UFC 289 co-main event at the Rogers Center in Vancouver. The former champ came ready for war, and despite being the underdog going into the fight, he went full-on beast mode from the very first bell. The Brazilian's game plan was working. He pushed the pace early, landing multiple shots before the fighters took things to the canvas. But don't forget, Benny's no stranger to winning on the ground. He's been working his way up the ranks and stepped into the fight with 8 consecutive wins. He even had top position and was trying to land ground strikes, but it was Do Bronx who came closest to finishing the fight with a nasty heel hook attempt. And he was obviously very comfortable on his back, even though he was losing the round. Based on his previous fight, UFC commentators John Anik, Paul Felder in DC were worried that the fight was going to end early and that Benny was going to get the win.
Don't completely understand, but I love you and I understand your pain.
But if there's one thing Oliveira's taught us, it's to never underestimate him. He got back on his feet and went to work on Benny, unleashing a flurry of strikes, which led to the fight coming to an end. After coming close with a head kick but missing his target, the Brazilian threw another. But this time, he landed one through Benny's guard and followed up with a punch that finally dropped him. The crowd was screaming as Do Bronx unloaded with ground strikes, forcing Dariush to turtle. And Jason Herzog stepped in to save him from more punishment. Fans completely lost it, and Oliveira celebrated his massive win by jumping onto the cage, then into the crowd in a wild celebration at the UFC's first Canadian event since September of 2019. This was a major win for Charles because 2022 was a rough year for him. Before his bout with Justin Gaethje at UFC 274, he was stripped of the 155-pound belt for missing weight, but it was later discovered that the scales were faulty, and the damage was already done. Oliveira still ended up beating Justin via first-round submission, but now he had to win his next fight to regain his title, and we all know how that turned out. In the UFC 280 main event, Do Bronx lost for the first time in nearly 5 years when Islam submitted him in the second round, and to prove his worth, he had to get back into lightweight title contention by stopping Dariush. And to be fair, most fighters try to duck Benny. Kevin Iole of Yahoo Sports called Dariush the most avoided fighter in the UFC because top contenders don't want to risk losing their spot in the rankings, especially not against an accomplished competitor looking for his big title shot. It's hard not to feel bad for Benny since this was the biggest fight of his career. After all, Oliveira is one of the most dominant fighters, holding UFC records for the most finishes and submission wins. But hey, Dariush isn't letting his first loss in 5 years get him down. He even shared a statement on Instagram to let his fans know that he was doing all right. And of course, losing to Do Bronx was a bitter disappointment for Dariush, who's been on the cusp of a UFC title shot for so long. Benny's fought hard to get where he is today, with decision wins over Gamrot, Tony Ferguson, Diego, and finishes over Scott Holtzman and Drew Dober. But as much talent as Benny has, Oliveira was on a roll, and he had some big things to say after the fight. During his post-fight interview, talk soon turned to Islam, the current champion, especially since Khabib's protege instantly reacted to the fight on social media, congratulating Oliveira but making it clear that he's still the best. Islam tweeted, "Congrats, Charles, but still there's levels in this game. Man, it's not every day you see someone congratulate a person and then threaten them at the same time. Only in the fight game, folks." And after hearing what his Dagestani rival had to say, Oliveira responded by asking the crowd, "Who's the champion?" And that's not all. Islam's super classy reply on Twitter mentioned how levels are part of the game, and he ended the tweet with a, "See you soon. Whoa, can you feel the heat of a rematch coming? Because I sure can." No one can deny that Do Bronx had one of the best title runs in the history of the lightweight division, and for many, he still deserves to have that belt. Not being the champ anymore has really changed things for the Brazilian, since he's now back on the grind to get the gold back, especially since Islam already successfully defended his belt with a controversial decision win over none other than the featherweight king Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 284. Islam's expected to return at UFC 294 in October of 2023, and while it's clear that he isn't taking Oliveira lightly, he still believes he's the reigning champion for a reason. I mean, the man's been dominant in his UFC career so far, and his record of 23 wins and 1 loss speaks for itself. For now, though, it's not exactly clear who his opponent's going to be, but Oliveira certainly hasn't harmed his chances of getting another crack at the belt. What I do know is that Dustin Poirier and Gaethje will rematch for the BMF strap at UFC 291, and the winner of that fight might get a shot at Islam before Oliveira gets a rematch. Probably the biggest reason why the rematch will happen, though, is that Dana White wants to see it. And for the most part, what Dana wants, Dana gets. And let's face it, Oliveira's in a tricky spot after his impressive win, since he beat the guy who was guaranteed a title shot if he were to win, but he also lost to the current champion at UFC 280. So his position's unique right now. And while Dana hasn't guaranteed a rematch against Islam, he did say that it makes sense. Dana called do Bronx a world beater, and looking at his stellar performances, everyone's excited to see what else he can bring to the rematch. After all, he was crushed in that first fight, so can he defy the odds and beat the man who seems invincible? Well, things look a little different this time. And while reacting to the win on Twitter, it's clear that fans are split in two. Some believe that do Bronx will be much more competitive in the next fight, but others aren't so sure. Some think Charles will end up being like Max Holloway in his rivalry against Volk. Of course, Holloway's an absolute killer, but he just can't seem to beat Volk, and the same goes for the rivalry between Israel Adesanya and Whitaker. Speaking of wanting to fight Islam for the title again, Charles claims he's ready to fight him anywhere, anytime, and even in his house. He says he was at his 10% when he fought Islam the last time, and now claims to be at 120%, ready to go anytime Dana decides. The reality is that Charles has beaten every lightweight within the top 5 rankings. He's still the #1 challenger, and I definitely think he had a bad night against Islam last time. I don't think it'll be quite the same in the next fight. I mean, this version of the former champ is much hungrier than before, which makes a second fight between the two way more interesting. Oliveira seemed unsure in their last meeting, and his usually precise striking was nowhere to be found. But the next time, I've got a feeling he'll come out guns blazing. Don't forget he's already beaten Gaethje and Dustin, so it doesn't make sense for him to fight the winner of that fight. All things considered, a rematch between the Dagestani and the Brazilian should be in order. Islam's grappling and wrestling skills are some of the best in the division, while Oliveira's striking and submission game are also top-notch. And if he can polish up on what he lacked in the last fight, he could give Islam a run for his money. Like with the Volk title defense, do Bronx has the opportunity to put on a show for the fans and show the world that he can hold his own against the Dagestani champ? To be honest, with how good Oliveira looked against Dariush, I think a rematch with Islam will surprise us all.
A big fans, hey, Charles Oliveira, a big champion. The champion is the name, the Charles Oliveira, brother.
So there you have it, fight fans. From do Bronx heading into his second title fight hungrier than ever, to his dominant performance against veteran Beneil Dariush, that's how Charles Oliveira's recent win sets up a rematch with Islam.